On this episode of the Rebel Health Tribe podcast, available at rebelhealthtribe.com, we welcome back to the show Jason Prall from jasonprall.com. He's also the host of the You Optimized radio podcast. So this is a special episode that we're sticking in here to discuss the what's happening with the DEA and CBD oil. Now, if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, or even familiar with what CBD oil is, I'll try and set this up really quickly. So CBD oil is one of our most popular supplements that we sell on our site next to Megaspore. We've got hundreds of testimonials from people who have been using it to help with pain and inflammation, with sleep disorders, with anxiety, stress, people using it for to help with seizures. These aren't medical claims. These are people who are actually contacting us and telling us what they're using it for and the success that they've had with it. And there's hundreds of thousands of people across the country who have been using it for these types of issues. So what CBD oil is, in a nutshell, is a non-psychoactive component of cannabis, or more specifically, industrial hemp. And that's an important distinction. Mike and Jason talk about that. So as of this recording, which is December 28th, CBD oil is completely legal. And if the DEA gets its way come January 13th, that might not be the case. What they're trying to do technically is make it a Schedule I controlled substance, which is insane and would put it in the same category as things like heroin and ecstasy. So I won't go too deep into this because this is the stuff that Mike and Jason talk about on the podcast. So I'll let you listen to it. And so what we're trying not to do is cause hysteria. The sky isn't falling, but we do have to be cautious here and maybe prepare a bit for the possibility that CBD oil may not be available after January 13th. Most experts that we've talked to have hope and don't believe that what the DEA is trying to do is legal, but that doesn't mean they won't do it or try to do it anyway. And that could certainly affect our ability to get it. So for me personally, I'm stocking up. I'm going to make sure I have a year's supply of the stuff. I think Mike is doing the same. That's, again, maybe we're being a little overly cautious here, but that's not an arbitrary number, 1 year. And if you listen to the podcast, you'll see why I'm saying that I want to make sure I have a year's supply of the stuff on hand. That's sort of the route we're going. So anyway, like I said, great information on this podcast from Jason Prall. Again, you could find him at jasonprall.com. So here's our special CBD episode of the Rebel Health Tribe podcast. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a special edition of the Rebel Health Tribe podcast. I am not your host, Joe Rignola. I am Michael Roseline. I will be going solo on this one. Joe is working actually on a Rebel Health report on the same topic right now, so that we have multiple things coming out of the subject, because we're getting a ton of inquiries and questions and everything pertaining to CBD and CBD oil and the doomsday rescheduling of CBD oil from our friends over at the DEA and the FDA. I don't even know which organization is doing what anymore. And we've brought in Jason Prall, our CBD expert, who you might know from our webinar that we did a while back. And Jason is also, you'll find him over at jasonprall.com, and he's got the You Optimized podcast. Jason, thanks for joining us again for this podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Unfortunately, we've got to cover this topic.
Yeah, it's I've seen everything online from, oh my God, the world is ending. We're never going to be able to have CBD again because it's dangerous and it's Schedule I, the death knell of any substance. And then I've seen other people say, screw them, we don't care, nothing's going to happen. And we're trying to make sense of it all, seeing as we have CBD available on our site. We've been getting tons of inquiries. And my response of isn't really cutting it at this point. So we're going to try to clear that up a little. So before we get into CBD itself, I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about what Schedule I even means, or what scheduling is for a herb or drug or substance or anything, and what can be scheduled, and what is Schedule I, and what else falls in that category.
Yeah, so just to kind of provide an overview for listeners, the DEA has Schedule I CBD and any other cannabinoids that come from essentially the cannabis plant. So What does that mean? Essentially Schedule 1 is it's sort of an arbitrary label, but essentially the idea of a Schedule 1 is that it has no medical use, and it can be described as a drug that has high potential for abuse. So, it's totally at the mercy of whatever you think that might mean. And the DEA is sort of in charge of setting these schedules. And for a long time, marijuana, or which they had as a definition of what marijuana is. And this is the hard part: is once you get into some of this stuff, it's all legal definitions. And so they have definitions of what marijuana is. They have definitions of what marijuana extracts are, or cannabis extracts. And previously, up until recently, cannabis extracts were left off. So marijuana is essentially defined as any substance coming from the cannabis plant that has higher than 0.3% THC. So, and that was the whole point, was to regulate THC, which does have psychoactive effects. Now, when this was sort of, well, let me get into this first. So that's Schedule 1. Schedule 2 is less restrictive. So for Schedule 1, you would include things like heroin, LSD, quote unquote marijuana, ecstasy, and peyote, and some of these other things. Now, interesting, a lot of these things come from plants. Peyote comes from cactus, and
mushrooms.
Psilocybin. Yep, exactly. So a lot of this is quite interesting. It's totally natural. It comes from plants. It does have a mind-altering effect, which you can argue one way or the other that might be beneficial to regulate on some level. But to say that it has no medicinal value or therapeutic value is completely false. And many of these things don't have a high potential for abuse. Things like DMT or peyote or psilocybin, they don't really have great effects in terms of addiction and abuse. So it's interesting how they even classify these things. Schedule 2, now that's a little less restrictive. So essentially Schedule 1 is the most restrictive.
And so you can't even legally do research or possess a Schedule 1 substance, right?
Correct.
So that's kind of what's hindered, because I know that there's some budding research going on elsewhere in the world on psychedelics, especially like LSD or psilocybin, and the brain and depression and things.
Yep. We're doing that in the U.S. actually, and you can possess it if you submit an application to the DEA and they approve that.
So it just makes it more difficult to study.
Absolutely. And so there are universities, there are research grants that have been issued to study these things, and they're being used in the clinical setting. So it's harder to get. And then so you have Schedule 2, Schedule 3, and Schedule 4. Schedule 4 being the most lenient. Things that are on Schedule 2 are things like cocaine, get in, methamphetamines, OxyContin.
So meth is not Schedule 1,
right? Adderall.
CBD is.
It's crazy how many people has OxyContin killed, and we know it's highly addictive.
Opiate addiction is one of the main contributing factors right now to the decreasing life expectancy.
Exactly, and so now they may provide a little bit of medical value in some regard, but to say that they're any more dangerous or provide less medical value than something like cannabis or LSD or peyote or DMT is pretty ridiculous. I mean, for all intents and purposes, they can be classified sort of in the same group. And then, a further distinction should probably be made, which is what is natural and what is synthetic. And so, again, these are all very kind of ridiculously classified substances.
I think that's too much logic for our drug policy.
Right. And then the other aspect is things like nicotine and alcohol, which are not scheduled.
At all.
And I think that's good. I mean, I actually do think that's good. I mean, nicotine actually does provide medicinal value, believe it or not. There are a number of studies showing its positive effects on the brain and treating Alzheimer's, dementia, ALS, all these things from the brain. And nicotine is found in foods. So, I mean, to schedule it is pretty much impossible because you have to exclude all these foods, which it's naturally found in. Same thing with alcohol, right? I mean, naturally fermented, fruits and these type of things happens all the time in nature. So it's hard to schedule those things. And then you have the religious aspects, which is the sacrament and all these things in terms of wine. So, alcohol and nicotine are tough to schedule. But at the end of the day, they do kill more people, particularly alcohol. I mean, I don't know if nicotine really does kill anybody, but
I don't
But,
think nicotine's the substance in cigarettes or tobacco usage that's doing the killing. I think it's the tar and the formaldehyde and the list of chemicals that you wouldn't fathom would be in there.
Exactly. So that's the schedule aspect, and it's very confusing. Now, this essentially started in 1962, and it didn't start in the U.S. Believe it or not, it actually came from the UN and the World Health Organization. They essentially created an international treaty to sort of monitor, regulate, and try to control this international drug trade. Primarily originating in Central and South America. So they granted power to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and they created their own schedule at the international level. And the international scheduling is even crazier. It's much more hard to understand. And from my research, and by the way, let me just preface all of this with saying that none of this is legal advice. This is my own research. It's very hard to understand a lot of this stuff because it's all over the place, and it does come down to legal definitions, and then you have international law and U.S.
So you
law.
can't sue us.
A mess, right? Yeah, exactly. But the international scheduling committee is Schedule 4 is the most strict, and anything that's on Schedule 4 is also on Schedule 1 in the international aspects. Schedule 2 and 3 are strict, and marijuana has been placed on Schedule 4 from the get-go, as I understand, or at least THC has. So it's very complex. It's kind of backwards. It's all over the place. But essentially, we created in the U.S. the Controlled Substances Act, the CSA, in 1970 under Richard Nixon, and that was in response to the international treaty set in 1962 by the UN and the World Health Organization. So we created our own branch to monitor things going on in the U.S., entering and exiting the U.S. and within the U.S. So in 1970, marijuana was determined to be, in our scheduling system, a Schedule 1 drug, so the most strict. But even in 1970, it was intended to be provisional. So it was intended to be put there until we could research its effects. So in other words, it's a safety. It was intended to be a safety precaution. So we put it on Schedule 1 to be sort of studied thereafter. And even when it was in 1970, essentially the main guy, Schaefer, who was sort of the chairman at that time, and I'm going to quote here because he says, the criminal law is too harsh a tool to apply to personal possession, even in the effect to discourage use. It implies an overwhelming indictment of the behavior which we believed is not appropriate. The actual and potential harm of use of the drug is not great enough to justify intrusion by the criminal law into private behavior, a step which our society takes only with the greatest reluctance. So even in 1970, they were saying we don't need to enforce this. It's the effects are not great enough for us to take action at the legal level. So
instead, we've locked up like 7 million people.
Right. It's been a disaster ever since. And then sort of the DEA has been that is the branch that is in charge of scheduling these things. Now, it's a little. Again, there's so many branches here that are involved, but the DEA is part of the Department of Justice, essentially the executive branch. It's essentially they're prohibited from using any federal funds to enforce the laws or the rules that would interfere with any of this cannabis hemp stuff that's going on. So just to recap, the DEA is part of the executive branch. It's
under the Department of Justice, who's under the Attorney General.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know, to be honest with you.
Okay.
But the important thing is the DEA is part of the executive branch. Okay, and that was set by the U.S. Constitution, and they have the authority to enact rules to carry out, but they don't have the legal authority to make the rules. So they can't. This is Congress decides these rules, and the DEA is actually just part of the system.
An enforcement tool.
Exactly, and they schedule things, but they cannot enforce create laws. They cannot. The DEA does not have the power to create laws. And anytime there is a discrepancy between congressional law and DEA, congressional law seems to always win. So it doesn't have the authority to enact these federal statutes. So that's an important thing to understand, that anytime the DEA has something in their scheduling system, it doesn't have the authority to enact any law. So it's simply a tool by which we can use to sort of understand some of these substances. and study them and that kind of thing. And it's used as a tool for Congress to make their decision, the laws as they see it. So it's always a matter of congressional rule. That's something to understand. And these CSA laws are governed by Congress. So that's critical in this whole aspect of things. But then as we go through 1973, again, we're studying this stuff. We're studying THC, we're studying cannabis, what its effects are. And in 1980, we discovered the cannabinoid receptor. So this is sort of a key turning point in our understanding of what cannabis does, of what marijuana will do to us behaviorally. So, and multiple times, even at the international level, there's been a number of challenges to the scheduling of cannabis or marijuana. So again, it's Schedule 4, which is the most harsh in international law. There's been a number of times that the World Health Organization and even the U.S. Government has made recommendations to remove it from Schedule 4 and place it into Schedule 2 or Schedule 3, which is a much more lenient system or scheduling class. So unfortunately, none of that's actually taken action. But believe it or not, the U.S. government has actually been sort of a friend in terms of the cannabis industry here to try to deregulate it a little bit on the international level. So it's very complex. It's hard to figure all this out. But at the end of the day, we have cannabis scheduled very stringently at the international level and also stringently at the U.S. level. But it's primarily the actions are against THC, not CBD and any of the cannabinoid extracts. So that's sort of the background of all this, and that's kind of what got us to today.
And what happened a week ago that freaked everyone out and caused this whole chaos that we've been seeing all these articles pop up saying CBD now Schedule 1 and you're not going to have CBD anymore and they're taking CBD away and all this stuff. What the hell happened that triggered all of this freak out panic attack response?
Right. So essentially the DEA Schedule 1 all the cannabinoids. So previously they had marijuana as defined in their legal definition of what marijuana is on a Schedule 1 basis, which includes essentially the flowering parts of the plant, anything that's going to contain THC higher than 0.3%, as Congress states. So Congress has stated that anything more than 0.3% THC is classified as marijuana. And so that's been a Schedule 1. Now the DEA has lumped in CBD and any of the other cannabinoids from any part of the cannabis plant. So this is a major sort of overstep of their legal authority, if you will. So things like CBD, CBG, CBA, CBN, CB, all these cannabinoids that come as part of the hemp or cannabis plant are now deemed to be illicit drugs, essentially, Schedule 1. And it's kind of impossible to find a hemp or cannabis product that doesn't have any CBD or any THC or any cannabinoids whatsoever. In fact, I don't even know if it's possible. And if it is, I don't know why you'd use it, because there's no real value other than perhaps industrial uses. But again, to create industrial hemp fiber or any product there, I don't know how it'd be impossible to remove all the cannabinoids. So it's kind of a silly law, and it really takes us back a number of years in terms of what we're able to do with the hemp products, because hemp products are a major industry in the U.S. and they're only growing. So, to try to enforce this law or to enact this law is a little ridiculous. And at the end of the day, again, Congress says that it's totally fine to have cannabis products or cannabinoids in a hemp or cannabis product as long as there's less than 0.3% THC.
So what's the point? Like, what the hell are they even trying to do? Like, is it a last grasp at trying to stop I mean, I just don't get it. Even the law, like what?
It's a good question. I mean, where did this come from? It seemed to be sort of slip in
right around the holidays, like nobody's paying attention.
Right. And so it's really hard to determine why they were doing this. And I should actually kind of elaborate too on the FDA and the DEA, because there's some confusion about who does what happens there. And essentially the FDA, they're concerned with food products, drug products, cosmetics, these type of things, making sure that everything on the market is safe and that they're okay. So they kind of oversee all the testing. They do a lot of that aspect. They inspect plants and foods and drugs and these kind of things. The DEA they ensure proper label, or FDA ensures proper labeling, all those type of things with food products.
The DEA is like the FDA's police.
Right. I mean, they're only concerned with controlled substances and the enforcing of controlled substances. So they enforce the laws, right? So they're almost like a police officer in that regard, right? Police officers don't make the laws; they just enforce the laws. That's sort of like the DEA on the federal level, and they enforce the laws pertaining to controlled substances and any misuse of drugs, selling of drugs, those type of things, and also if there's any doctors writing unnecessary prescriptions. So,
we know that never happens.
Right, exactly. So it's the FDA and the Department of Health Services. They essentially they are responsible for performing scientific assessment of these schedule or changes to any DEA substances. So if DEA schedules it, that now it's actually the FDA and health services essentially are tasked with the job of looking at the research of identifying, is there anything in the research to suggest that this is that there's no medicinal value and that it's a high danger risk essentially to the public.
In regards to CBD specifically, in case somebody doesn't know or they haven't seen anything else we've done, how much evidence or research is there that CBD does have medicinal value or does have health benefits to it?
I mean, there's tons. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of, if not thousands of research studies to show that not only CBD, but THC and CBG and CBN. So all of the cannabinoids in and of themselves have been shown to have a medicinal or therapeutic value.
Wouldn't that by definition default them out of Schedule 1?
You would think.
Technically.
I mean, yes. I mean, that again, the DEA can schedule something.
It could schedule bananas if it wants to.
Right. And what's interesting is that anybody can actually make a recommendation for scheduling a drug. You can. So you can actually petition to have something scheduled. A banana. You can petition to have that scheduled. Congress can do it.
Bananas.
Right. Anybody can do this. Again, once the DEA has sort of collected the necessary data, they request from HHS, sort of a scientific and medical evaluation, right? And then the HHS gets information from the FDA and the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and usually also from the scientific and medical community just in general.
And then they give their report back.
And then they send it back to the DEA, right? And this is sort of the medical and scientific evaluation regarding any drug or any substance. And then the FDA or the HS and they actually make a recommendation as to whether the drug should be controlled and in which schedule it should be placed. But
which percentage of those organizations just doesn't need to exist?
Oh, I mean, that's the thing. It's just
like,
there's just so much going on.
It's like 27 middlemen and but okay, so say they did that with the cannabinoids and the THC and everything, and then they sent, and the HHS did their thing and they did their report, they gathered all their information. Obviously, if they actually did that, they would find thousands of instances of research showing benefits to all of these compounds, in which case did they just not report that back to the DEA, or does the DEA just be like, thanks for your, we're going to throw that in the trash, or like?
Well, no, so that's the thing. So if HHS recommends that it not be scheduled, then the DEA cannot schedule it. They don't have the right to schedule a substance if the AHS makes a final decision and says, no, this should not be scheduled. If they do, if the HHS comes back to the DEA and says, okay, we recommend that this be Schedule 1, the DEA actually has the ability to either schedule that or not. But again, if HHS says
so, HHS must have told them that it was okay to schedule it Schedule 1.
Well, here's where it gets interesting. So under certain circumstances...
because it wasn't already interesting.
You're right. The government may temporarily schedule a drug without following the normal procedure. So this allows the Attorney General to sort of temporarily place a substance on Schedule 1 to avoid kind of this imminent hazard to public safety, which that's an important clause, because if something were to
Does it say imminent hazard in the language?
Yes, it does. Yeah. So it's a great clause in the sense it gives us an out if something were
like
to
if a street drug
about.
called like yellow popped up and it was like killing thousands of people, they could schedule it quickly without having to do the research on it.
And when that takes place, you essentially they give 30 days notice. 30 days notice is required before the order can be issued, and then the scheduling of that sort of temporary substance is temporarily it's removed after a year. So actually, this sounds very much like what happened in December. They sort of slipped in this schedule, CBD and all other cannabinoids, into Schedule 1. And what they did was they gave 30 days notice to anybody that's selling or manufacturing CBD. Says you have 30 days to comply. So, I don't know if that's what happened. It's really hard to find information as to exactly how that unfolded, but it very much appears that is sort of the clause that they used to sort of temporarily and expeditiously schedule this thing as Schedule 1. So
they skipped the
normal process. Now, I mean, granted, we've had, especially since 1980, since we figured out that we have cannabinoid receptors, we've had 30 plus years at least to study this stuff and understand. So there shouldn't be any emergency.
That's even with the legal hurdles of having it scheduled in the first place to do the research.
Right. And I should say that when they do this, it's not subject to judicial review. So it actually cannot be reviewed by law. So it's sort of this executive power that they have to temporarily schedule something. Now it expires after a year. So I guess if there's any light at the end of the tunnel, and this is the clause that they use to do this, perhaps after a year it gets removed, if that's their intent. But who knows? I have no clue what the intent was here. CBD especially, I mean, all the cannabinoids besides THC seem to not have any psychoactive effect. So you can take a boatload of CBD and have zero psychoactive effects, and yet tons of therapeutic potential here. So again, if you're using logic and reasoning to look at any of this, you're going to fall on your face because none of it makes sense. You just have to look at this from a legal standpoint, and the legal precedence and the structure is there to provide them the ability to do this. Again, why? Who knows?
I've learned when I see things that don't make sense, or that go against the public interest, or that abuse a law or a situation, or that have regulatory things placed on them that are absurd or whatever, it always is best to figure out who benefits from this situation, or
where the money's coming.
Where's the money? Who's making money, or who's not making money, or who's going to make less money or more money? Yep. And in this instance, not just with CBD, but with medical cannabis, with some of the psychedelics you mentioned that are Schedule 1 that are really, really difficult to get a hold of for research, like LSD or DMT or psilocybin or any of that stuff. MDMA even is being really successfully used for PTSD in the Bay Area. I know there's a center set up where they're using that.
But see, here's what's interesting too, is that there was a drug that was manufactured way back when called Marinol. That's the drug name. I think Dronabinol or something to that effect is the sort of compound name. But essentially, it's a synthetic THC. So if they were manufacturing a drug that was essentially a manufactured THC or synthetic THC, clearly they knew that there's medicinal value. So to Schedule 1 something that has medicinal value, even if it has supposed dangers, which
that would make it by definition Schedule 2 or 3.
Well, and that's the thing; it's a loose definition. There is it's not black and white. They can do whatever they want. And again, it's up to the recommendations from HHS and the FDA and these type of things. So, it's subject to whatever they really want to do. But in light of the supposed way that that they think about scheduling, it doesn't seem to fit the bill to.
So where's the money? And I know you know the answer to this question, but who's losing millions or billions of dollars by people using CBD or medical marijuana in place of opiate painkillers, in place
Yeah.
of anti-anxiety medications, in place of anti-depression medications, in place of sleeping aids, in place of, I mean, what are the sale numbers? And this is pharma we're talking about. And again, we'll throw out another legal disclaimer. Don't sue us. But, I've seen some numbers coming out of Colorado that are pretty staggering regarding less opiate related overdoses and deaths, less money spent on opiate medications, less drug related deaths and addiction as a whole.
Yep.
Pretty profound considering it's been maybe 2 years. I don't even know how long it's been legalized in Colorado, but like that's a lot of money. And we've had testimonials galore from people just in the 3 months that we've had CBD available on our site saying, I was able to get off these pain pills, or I used CBD post dental surgery and I didn't even take my pain pills, or I take it for my monthly cramps, which I was taking piles of ibuprofen for before. And people often forget, pharma that you get prescriptions from is the same pharma, is it not, that sells drugs over the counter?
Right.
These are the same companies making Advil that are making, whatever, Percocet or whatever other things, right? It's the same. I think people tend to look at those as two separate industries, and it's not. It's the same.
Same industry. And the thing is, it's actually, synthetic THC drugs are being used for post-cancer treatment, or, so they're being used by the medical industry right now for things like cancer, to influence the immune system and these type of things. So, to say that THC, even supposedly the most dangerous aspect of the cannabis plant, which is THC, to say that it doesn't have medicinal value is completely false. And so they're using this right now in the drug industry, and it's.
What about CBD?
So CBD we all know it's being used in the supplement industry, in the food industry, actually, for a lot of medicinal reasons. And the catch with CBD is that there's a company called GW Pharmaceuticals. So a pharmaceutical company that currently has something called Epidiolex. And this is a drug that they've created that is synthetic CBD. And it's gone through, I think there's 3 total successful phase 3 trials. So they put this synthetic CBD drug through phase 3 trials, which is sort of the last component to getting something approved. And it's been used for something called Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, and Dravet syndrome, or Dravet syndrome. I don't know how you say that, but essentially these are childhood epilepsy issues. And so they're using CBD, synthetic CBD, to treat childhood epilepsy. And they've gone through 3 successful phase 3 trials, one in March, one in June, and one in September of this year. And they're expected to submit a new drug application to the FDA in the first half of 2017. So isn't this interesting that, in December, we have this sort of emergency, or potentially this clause that's set up to protect our people from getting, influenced
poisoned by CBD, drugs, addicted to CBD.
Right, but they're using that, I think, and I don't know. But
this is all conjecture at this point. Don't sue us.
They put something, they scheduled it essentially, and they gave people 30 days notice to comply, and now they have this FDA, potentially FDA approved drug coming out in 2017.
And what's the company making that?
It's GW Pharmaceuticals. So essentially, they can issue this stuff and make a shitload of money off of it, but you and me can't pick up CBD products from a supplement company, or a CBD butter, or
they don't want competition.
Any of this stuff, exactly. And so,
why synthetic? Why can you? I know why, but can you explain why a drug company? So they would get, the way it would work is they get CBD from a plant, natural CBD.
Yep. They
study the molecular structure of it. Then they synthetically create it in a laboratory to be, I'm not sure if they can make it 100% identical, 99.7% identical to natural CBD. I'm just using that percentage. I have no idea what it actually is, but it has to be altered in some way.
Yep.
And then they make a synthetic version of it and they sell it as a drug. Why do they do that?
Yeah, it all comes down to patents. So you can't patent a naturally grown or a naturally occurring substance. So if anything exists in the natural world, you can't patent it. But if you alter it chemically, I don't even know how much you have to, probably just a fraction. Then all of a sudden you can create a patent under that to protect that.
They did that with fish oil.
Right, essentially, yeah. So, and that patent is what will allow GW Pharmaceuticals to essentially own the rights to this synthetic compound that they've created. And they can make, billions or trillions of dollars off this stuff until the patent expires. And when the patent expires,
government agents shut down all the competition and
right. And then when the patent expires, then it opens the door for anybody else who's capable of manufacturing these substances. And they can sort of create these generic versions. And that's why you see all these generic versions of Advil and Tylenol and ibuprofen and all these things, right?
Because the patent expired, so then other companies can make it.
But, you and I don't have the technological capability to create this stuff. I mean, it takes millions of dollars just to even try. So, even then, it's still...
I'd rather just take the one that exists already anyways.
That is developed in nature and probably, and it acts better.
We evolved with, and it actually works better and everything. Because I'm sure in every single instance, the natural one would beat the synthetic one in a head-to-head clinical trial, whether or not by effectiveness, but definitely with reduced side effects or something, because it's not how it's supposed to be.
Absolutely. And so... But here's the key thing, too, to understand is that they, despite all this sort of fear that we've embedded in this podcast in terms of the legal aspects of things, at the end of the day, the DEA does not have the capacity to enforce this stuff. So who's going to enforce it? I mean, it's congressionally, it's legal. The DEA is Schedule 1'd it, but who cares? They aren't even allowed to use government money to enforce this stuff. So, there's
it's
really
just a scared tactic.
It seems like it's information to scare people off, to give it a more to create fear. To create fear in the substance of CBD. CBD's anything that's Schedule 1, the general population thinks probably bad, right? We got to stay away from it. It's dangerous. They wouldn't Schedule 1 if it wasn't dangerous for us. So it kind of creates this fear around CBD and THC. And now, it essentially scares people off from a legal standpoint, because trying to understand this crap legally is just a nightmare, even for lawyers who are well-versed in this type of thing. And then even if you have, a case, even if you are in your legal right, if they want to prosecute or, good luck fighting that battle. That's going to be a pretty expensive thing to fight. So, somebody like you or me may have a supplement that contains CBD. Do we have the legal resources to even fight this stuff, even if we are correct? Who knows?
We may not, but luckily this industry is bigger now.
It is.
And it's bigger by the scale of like natural health industries. The cannabis industry is probably the single most powerful, I would guess, at this point. I just read an article the other day on how the cannabis industry saved California from the giant recession we've been under the last 8 years, and how it's like the third or fourth largest industry in the state. And our state is the fifth largest economy in the world. So that means that the cannabis industry is massive, which in our legal system, for better or worse, means that they can get shit done in court. And I think that if the DEA attempted to enforce this, or something happened where they're raiding CBD manufacturers, you and I aren't going to take the U.S. government to court, but I think there's people who could, that would, and that may win.
Right.
Maybe not. They're still smaller than the drug companies by exponential.
Well, and I think the thing that we have on our side from a legal standpoint is the fact that we passed the Farm Bill in 2014. And in large part, this was due to Dr. Bronner's, the company that makes soaps and that kind of thing.
Prints weird stuff all over their labels.
Yeah, well, yeah, but hemp was a big part of what they were doing. They understood the industrial value of hemp, and so they wanted to include hemp in a lot of their products. So they essentially helped establish the definitions of what marijuana is, which is essentially the 0.3% or less of THC in a product, and it comes from certain parts of the plant.
So then that's considered hemp, and anything over 0.3% THC is considered marijuana or cannabis. Technically, by the law rule.
Marijuana. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And so, but it also has to do with where in the plant it
Which
comes
is
from.
a slang term to begin with.
Right. But is it coming from the flower? Is it coming from the stalk, the leaves, the seeds? There's all kinds of, it's a nightmare in terms of what all these definitions are. But essentially, the 2014 Farm Bill which was passed by Congress, is sort of the footing that we have in terms of CBD, the legality of CBD.
As long as it comes from industrial hemp.
Right, exactly. And so, and again, the DEA and the Department of Justice are prohibited from using any federal funds. So they cannot use the federal funds to enforce any laws that would interfere with hemp or any hemp product that are in sort of in accordance with that farm bill. So if you have a product that's in accordance with the farm bill, again, the farm bill, where the hemp or where the cannabinoids come from is at less than 0.3% THC, totally cool with the farm bill. So again, the DEA scheduling aspect of things doesn't really pertain to this, and they can't use federal funds to enforce it. So in other words, who's going to enforce this stuff? And on what legal ground do they have to enforce it anyway, if it doesn't, conflict with the farm bill? So you can see that there's just a massive legal issue here. And again, what I think it comes down to is creating a fear and smear campaign against CBD, and should try to kind of strong arm the industry on some level to stop producing the products.
Just like they did with ephedra, just like they do with kratom, which was actually defeated.
Right. And a number of states, and this is the other aspect, which is you have the federal law aspect, but then you have states that have created, passed farm bill for, to use hemp from a commercial standpoint or a research standpoint. And there's, I think, over 36 or so states that have done this. I think 20 or so use it for commercial products, and then the other 16 are using it for research processes. So the states have passed legal definitions and legality to use hemp appropriately. And so, again, it's just this massive issue with what the DEA, what kind of power they have in terms of enforcing and enacting some law that is, or rule that is contrary to the Farm Bill and what other states have legally passed. So at the end of the day, I have no clue how this is going to shake out. It seems to be in support of the pharmaceutical industry and their new drug coming out in 2017. And, the crossing of state lines in terms of CBD products, very hard to say. California has passed the Farm Bill and is approved for commercial hemp products. Now, can CBD products cross state lines? I think it's probably up to the state to determine that at the state level. So again, I don't know. I know some companies have received cease and desist letters from state governments, but again, on what grounds, it's hard to say.
And how would it be enforced and whatever? We changed our Edible Alchemy, where we get our CBD from, changed their label recently due to this whole situation, to where it's now called hemp 500 and hemp 2500 instead of CBD 500 and CBD 2500. The product remains exactly the same. The ingredients are exactly the same. They're just trying to comply with the changing, storm of what's going on. So we've been keeping our people informed on that, which they're pretty, up to date on, regarding all of what we've experienced thus far. But it sounds like it's just a massive, nobody knows what's actually going to happen, but that if anything actually does happen, whoever's doing it is overstepping their legal boundaries to do so, and would probably be up for a hell of a court fight if it came down to it. Personally, I know I'm stocking up. I just got a whole bunch of CBD for myself that would probably last me a solid year, that in case something does go down that we're not expecting, or that it does get enforced, or something changes. And if not, it's got a long shelf life, so I'll be okay. But
yeah, and that's
Doomsday prepping my CBD situation.
And again, this was quite expected to some degree. The legal
because of the progression of the drug testing.
Yes and no. I mean, it's just been there's so many components to this plant that is being regulated, and there's been so much confusion, and there's clearly a desire to have CBD and THC products out there for therapeutic uses. So, we see states like Colorado, Washington, California, and some of these other ones that have approved the legal sale of cannabis products that include THC and or CBD. So, there's a desire at the state level and by the public to have these products. And so on one hand, you have this massive demand coming, but then on the other hand, you have the DEA, you have, again, the international laws and all these things. So it's been a mess. And if you're in the industry, you understand that, in other words, you should have expected this rocky terrain coming, because it's such a a mess right now. And so until we get it all sorted out, this type of thing is somewhat expected, to see all kinds of legal issues coming about. So, it's not totally surprising. But if I was a consumer of CBD products, that relied on them for therapeutic uses, I would probably stock up to some degree. I would make sure you have a couple months of stock, because again, it's so all over the map. You don't know what's going to happen, because all these entities are getting involved and trying to enforce things that they may or may not have the legal ground to actually do. But nevertheless, until you fight them, they're going to sort of strong arm you and push you around as a company. So, some companies are small and they have no choice but to comply, as opposed to fight. So until that legal battle is sort of decided in the courts, you kind of have to, you got to play this game. You got to play this game of, you
dancing
don't know
around and skirting things and paying attention to fine prints and everything else. And I don't think a lot of people realize the money at stake with the cannabis industry and the CBD and THC and even the other plant medicines we mentioned. Like, the drug industry alone is already being impacted in the billions as far as reduced use of pharmaceutical drugs. As the laws change in states like Colorado, Washington, California, I think there's 9 now states, or 8 or 9 states, where cannabis has been fully legalized for recreational use, everything like that. Then you're looking at private prison profits going down, budgets for prison systems going down, cost of courts, police, all that other stuff going down. And we can look at it as cost going down, but somebody's losing that money. Like, that was going to someone somewhere. So for them, it's profit going down, not cost going down. So between the drug enforcement, the drug imprisonment and sentences in courts, the lack or less purchasing of pharmaceuticals, and I'm sure and plus, like, just the industrial impact that hemp can have between making paper and clothing and plastics. And when I read The Emperor Wears No Clothes, and now I don't know if that book is 100% verified. It makes a lot of claims regarding what can be done with hemp. But if even half of what the book claims could be created and done and produced with industrial hemp, you're easily looking at trillions of dollars a year. It could transform the entire economy.
I haven't read that book, even though people have told me to read it. But I can tell you that, just from my research in the uses of industrial hemp, it's, insanely widespread, not only for paper and for textiles, but, if we used hemp instead of cotton in many areas, we would reduce the runoff and the water use. It can be used in solar cells or batteries. It can be used for a number of products that, in fact, it's much more conductive than the solar batteries that we're using now, the solar panels. So we can use it in an amazing amount of ways. From drywall to construction in general. It's pretty amazing. So the fact that it's so cheap, so easy, so sturdy,
grows really fast.
Yeah, it's almost like a bamboo in a sense of it makes a shitload more sense. But its uses are tenfold that of bamboo. So it would transform the economy. It really would, and especially in a place like California, there's so much land here. It could literally save the economy of California so that it's not bankrupt every year. So it's strange, and at the end of the day, you're right. I think it comes down to who's losing money, where the influence is coming from at the legal level or at the governmental level. And right now, again, you have to completely disregard logic and common sense
to understand these rulings.
Yeah, because it doesn't make sense.
Cool.
And we talk about the medicinal aspects, which
we didn't. We have it on the webinar. Check out the webinar on our site, or Mike's got a couple articles, Mike Boone, coming out on our site too. And you can just look around the internet. They're everywhere. There's hundreds of. We've gotten dozens of testimonials the last few months just from people in our circles emailing us with XYZ issues that are getting better, and pain reductions and inflammation, and I sleep better, or could this have impacted my mood, and all these things. So yeah, that's a given at this point. There's no question that it is a beneficial compound for a lot of people, and that it's help. And people have emailed us like, help, what am I going to do? I don't want to go back on those drugs.
Right.
I know that they're bad for me. And so people now know that. And I guess all we can do is spread education and information and awareness, because ultimately, as corrupt or questionable or whatever as some of these entities or organizations may be, technically they work for us.
Right.
Like, technically. And if enough people know what the hell's going on and get involved, we should be able to change the way that they operate.
Yeah. And so, to kind of cap all this off, I would say that nothing has really changed despite the new classification of CBD and other cannabinoids. The DEA has always kind of maintained that any part of the cannabis plant should be a Schedule 1. They just updated their definitions. They have no ability to enforce this stuff using funds, or they don't have the ability on any level to enforce this, and it contradicts the Farm Bill, which is passed by Congress. So, it on one hand, it doesn't change anything from a legal standpoint. On the other hand, it may push some entities at the state level or even the federal level to start to, send out these letters, cease and desist letters and that kind of thing. It's hard to say. So, to be safe, if I was a consumer of this stuff, I would probably just get, I would stock up a little bit. But other than that, it's not something to fear. It's not something to worry about. I don't think it's going to radically change the landscape of THC, CBD, cannabis products. They're going to continue, and what's really going to happen, I think, is it's going to all come from the state level. So the states are going to legalize this stuff and make use of it, and at the federal level, they're going to have no choice but to overturn all their shitty laws. I mean, we saw this with so many aspects, like women's right to vote and gay marriage and these type of things. So they happen at the state level. That's sort of the benefit here, is that we have some states' rights that can help push things along. And as what we end up seeing is that the more states get involved, all of a sudden the federal government doesn't have a choice. They have to just submit to what's really happening out there. So, and again, the research, the science, everything is on the side of the consumer, of the user of things like cannabis in general, and CBD and THC and all these other cannabinoids. So, again, if nothing else, hopefully we can provide a message that it doesn't really change much.
Okay, well, I'm glad we figured that out. But no, it's good. But yeah, that's kind of going to be my approach. Is just stocking up a little bit and making sure I have some, if anything were to go down, and keeping on it. And people just need to get involved and get educated and get active. And these states didn't legalize it just because they wanted to. They legalized it because millions of people in those states were pushing for it.
Exactly.
And got active. And when there was a referendum, they went and knocked on doors and they educated their neighbors and they got involved. And that's what it takes.
Yep.
And it's not just going to happen for you. No one's going to be handing over their billions of dollars in profits voluntarily.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is you have to look at the generational aspect of this. So in the 50s, it was very frowned upon. The kids in the 60s and 70s were doing a lot of drugs, the LSD and cannabis and psilocybin and all of these things. And so that generation, the 60s and 70s kids, are now the ones kind of in charge. And so you have a little bit more open-mindedness at those state levels, and from a legal standpoint and the governmental standpoint. So I think we're going to see this continue based on that generational aspect. And then, of course, anybody born after 1980 or so has kind of grown up in an era of really not fearing this stuff too much. And so the general feel, I think, is that the younger generations continue with this notion that we need to legalize this stuff. It's ridiculous. And so you're going to see the wave change, I think, as sort of the older generations die out and the new generations are coming up with, a little bit more power and control and ability to change things. So, I think that's just what you're going to see. This industry is primed to move forward. It's just a matter of kind of crossing these hurdles as they come up.
Okay. Well, as always, your time and expertise and research are appreciated. You've obviously done your homework in this regard. And, we're going to do the best we can to try to get the information out there and always be providing the up-to-date of what's going on and what's not going on, or what shouldn't be going on, or what might be going on, or what could go on, and try to make sense of all the chaos and the ridiculousness. So we're going to get this one edited and out there pretty quickly, as it's a time-sensitive matter. So if you're listening to this, don't panic. You might want to just grab some extra CBD.
Yep.
And if that's something that you use, and just keep your eye on what's going on. So Jason, Thanks a ton. We always appreciate it. If anyone wants to check out Jason's website, is jasonprall.com. His podcast is You Optimized Radio. You can learn about CBD and a whole bunch of other awesome stuff that not many people are talking about over there. Also contact him for consults and things of that nature. So head on over there, check him out. Thanks a lot, Jason.
Hey, thank you. Have a good one.